How's it going, everybody? Recently, I've started getting into something that I like to call cubing alchemy. So the way it works is that you make little cube recipes. So first, I'll start off with a base of some MGC 6x6, then add in some MGC 5x5, and then just a pinch of MGC 4x4. Shake it all up, and
would you look at that perfect MGC 7x7.
Basically anything that's not the first of its kind is going to be derivative in some way. It's always going to take inspiration from previous things, and cubing is obviously no exception to this when it comes to cubing hardware. Different designs, different features, different feelings of the cubes often repeat over time in terms of cubes. And this is not really something that you see cubers really talking about or complaining about or discussing, but I think it might actually be at least somewhat important. But what types of derivativeness when it comes to cubes should we be concerned about? Should we be concerned about repeating designs, repeating feels, repeating features? And why should we be concerned about them? Well, to answer that question, we're going to be looking at a cube that released last year, the MGC 7x7. So this video is going to be a combination of reviewing the MGC 7x7 and discussing repeating features, feelings, and designs in cubes.
Just as all the other MGC big cubes did, the MGC 7x7 comes in a nice box, which is with the same sort of theming as the other boxes. And it's got this sleeve just like the other boxes as well. When you open up the cube, or the box, you find the cube and an accessories box. In this accessories box, you got the standard stuff, the cube pamphlet, the extra springs and magnets, the screwdriver, but you have also got something else pretty interesting. This sort of put together cube stand. Now, this is something that's cool if you can figure out how to make it work. I just question why they had to do this. I guess it's kind of cool to, put it together, but it's also really hard to put it together. I just don't see the point of having this over just a regular old cube stand when it could have just fit just as well in the packaging as this kind of, I guess, kind of more compact form of a cube stand, but yeah. And then you have the cube, which has some super unique and awesome looking shades, and it's got a nice piece design look to it, and it looks very distinct from other cubes. This is an MGC 6x6, you dummy. Yeah, in case you couldn't tell, this is where the whole derivative stuff starts to come into play. The MGC 7x7, in terms of visuals and shades, basically looks identical to the MGC 5x5 and 6x6, which could be a problem, could not be a problem, depending on the person. But we'll get to that eventually. Now let's get into the turning of this cube. When I first started turning the cube, I was surprised at how fast it was and how light the turning sort of felt. The cube wasn't super light, but the turning felt light. That might have been to the magnet strength, which is far from strong even on the inner layers, but I'll get to that in a bit. It almost feels like a combination of the feeling from the 6x6 and the speed from the 5x5. Now, this is another whole thing of ooh, it's the same as the other ones, but again, we'll get to that eventually. It's still a super nice feeling, especially for a 7x7, which usually those don't have too much of a great feeling to them, especially older ones, but it still feels very nice. I did notice when I was first turning it and doing the first few saws, there are a lot of catches and even a few almost pops, but once I tightened it, those aren't really an issue anymore. It was just something that you have to keep in mind. You probably are going to want to tighten this cube out of the box. In terms of specs, this cube is $35 on the cubicle.com, less if you use code Nathan5 for 5% off at checkout. And it is 200 grams, which is not too bad for a 7x7. It's much less than the Haze 7 and a tiny, tiny bit more than the Spark. Speaking of the Spark, it's 68 millimeters across, which is a little bit bigger than the Spark. I've seen a lot of people complain about the size of its cube, saying it's too big, but I haven't really paid attention too much to the size of the cube. It basically is completely fine for my hands. It's not really much of a difference at all. But I don't have the Spark, so take that all with a grain of salt. Anyways, this cube's magnet strength is pretty light. On the outer layers, light magnets are pretty much normal, and I'd say these magnets are actually kind of stronger than the Haze 7's outer magnets, but the inner magnets are also pretty light as well, which I don't really like to see. I like to see when there's stronger magnets on the inner layers, but that's just my personal preference, and it's not a huge deal at all. Moving on to the performance of this cube, this is probably where the MGC 7x7 shines the most. Before I sort of took my cubing break, I was averaging around 345 on 7x7, but after taking my break, I was averaging around 4 minutes on the Haze 7. But with the MGC 7x7, I was about right at my average times with almost no practice. Just immediately solving, I was basically back at my other times, which is really promising if I'm going to get back into 7x7 solving. And I was even able to get a couple really good times on the cube, like a 325 and a 321 respectively. So yeah, this is probably one of the best performing 7x7s on the market, especially for the very low price for a 7x7. So as we've seen, the MGC 7x7 is an excellent performing cube with a nice feeling and a very, very reasonable price. However, we've also seen that it's kind of derivative when it comes to its predecessors, the MGC 5x5 and the MGC 6x6. But is this even a problem, or is it just YJ being consistent? Well, it's actually kind of complicated.
To understand the MGC 7x7, we really need to look at the couple main ways that a cube can sort of be very similar to another cube, and it makes it a problem. The first way is that it's very similar in terms of the features it includes. An example of this would be the Yuexiao EDM and the GAN XS. The Yuexiao EDM, when it came out, had a cool magnet system where you would sort of push the thing in on the edge piece to change the magnet strength, and then GAN basically copied it in the GAN XS. So this was kind of a problem in terms of GAN sort of just copied the design. Although not a lot of people just didn't really pay attention to that because the Yuexiao EDM wasn't a very good performing cube. It did have that innovation, but it wasn't a very good performance type cube. And then you have the other type, which is design and feeling similarities. Now this is mostly a problem between cubes that are the same type, which we'll get to that eventually. But like for example, all of the GAN 3x3s that have come out recently are fairly similar in terms of design and feeling, almost too similar to warrant there being multiple of them. This is a problem because there's no real point to a cube existing if there's another cube that came before it that's basically the exact same. They might try to hype it up with new features, but if it's just the same cube, then what's really the point? Now we come to the MGC 7x7. You see, the MGC 7x7 may be very similar in terms of design and feeling to the MGC 5x5 and 6x6, but it's a different type of cube to those, so that warrants a reason for it to exist. It's not like an MGC 7x7 and an MGC 7x7 V2 that's extremely similar to it. It's different cubes, so you can't exactly replace the MGC 7x7 with the MGC 6x6. But there's also sort of a problem with it being the same in terms of feeling, and that is the fact that it might turn off certain people. Let's say you have the MGC 5x5 and 6x6, but you don't really like the feeling of them. You prefer feeling of the cube like Shadow version 2 or the Volk 5 to those cubes. Well, that means you probably won't get the MGC 7x7 even if it is maybe the best on the market, because you don't like that feeling and you know that it's the exact same in that cube. So when you get down to it, the MGC 7x7 is very similar to the MGC 6x6 and 5x5, enough that it could be considered sort of derivative and it's too similar to those cubes. But when you think about it, is that really a problem? YJ is just trying to be consistent with their cubes. They want people to know that this is an MGC cube, so it feels like an MGC cube. They want to make cubes faster instead of reinventing the wheel every single time they try and make a cube. And even though it may turn off a small part of the community because it has the same feeling as the other cubes, there's not really that many people who seem to really dislike the feeling of the MGC cubes. So while the MGC 7x7 is derivative, I would say it's the best kind of derivative ever. So with that in mind, guys, if you like the MGC 5x5 and 6x6 and want to get a new 7x7, I would absolutely 100% recommend the MGC 7x7. It's a really fantastic cube, and it performs great, and it's a great deal for only $35. And remember, you can get it for less than $35 when you use the code Nathan5 at checkout for 5% off. Alright, so I've decided to do some more cubing alchemy, but make it more interesting. Instead of just having MGC parts, I've added a bunch of other things to spice it up and make a more unpredictable result. So, let's see here. Let's see if this works. I don't think it worked. Maybe I just need to remove the bad ingredient. Guhong V4 screwdriver. That's a pretty bad ingredient. Alright, let's try it again. It still didn't work? Well, I have this keychain Rubik's brand in here. That's not a very good thing. Let's see here. Still nothing. Maybe this piece of a YJ stand? Still nothing. Maybe these pieces from a really worn out 3x3? Still nothing. Maybe this Wojia square 1 piece? Wait a second. This is only MGC parts. There's no getting around this, is there?